Today, I welcomed the opportunity to rest after long hours spent writing in my diary and working around the camp. I have been working 16-hour days, so I indulged in a pleasant nap for a couple of hours this afternoon. I decided to take a leisurely stroll along the shore, which was covered in sand filled with glittering small crystals. Some members of our group believe that these crystals may hold some value. As I walked, I noticed craters emitting steam from the water below. The water was so hot that I could feel the heat from a distance of 40 to 50 feet, and the lake surrounding the craters was too cold for a refreshing swim. In some places, the water was strongly impregnated with sulfur. One of the craters even released a jet of steam with a hissing sound as loud as the blowing off of a steamboat's safety valve. As the sun began to set, I caught a glimpse of the 3 Tetons in the southwest direction. One of my companions asked about the meaning of the name Teton given to these mountains. Lieutenant Doane educated us, saying the French explorers named these mountains after the French word woman's breast because of their peculiar shape. I cannot help but think that the man who named them must have done so from a great distance. As we approach them, the once graceful curvilinear lines that inspired their name become angular and ragged. From where we stood, the name seemed like a misnomer. If there were 12 of them instead of 3, they should be named the Titans because of their relation to the surrounding country. The person who named them after a woman's bosom must have been emotional and possibly dwelled in these solitudes for an extended period. I can hardly begin to imagine how one could find any resemblance to a woman's gentle bosom in these cold and barren peaks. Monday, September 5th. Lieutenant Doane slept through the entirety of last night, taking a monumental 36-hour rest. Once he was up and about, he tended to his thumb, and we took an observation to determine our elevation. As it turned out, we were 7,714 feet above sea level. We broke camp at 9 in the morning. Once the train was in motion, I asked Mr. Hedges to remain behind and help me triangulate the distance across the lake and to the Tetons using a rudimentary system. However, laying out a long enough baseline proved to be too difficult, so we gave up on the endeavor after 2 hours of futile labor. We followed the advanced party's trail along the lake's beach for approximately 6 miles. Along the way we passed several small hot sulfur springs and lukewarm sulfur ponds, as well as 3 hot steam jets surrounded by sulfur incrustations. After 6 miles, we departed from the beach and trekked through the plateau that overlooked the lake. The plateau was covered in towering pine trees and a plethora of fallen timber, which made our progress difficult at times. Not far from the trail was an alkaline spring that measured 6 feet in diameter. 15 miles south of our starting point, we arrived at our campsite on the lake's shore. Our campsite offered a magnificent view of the lake, which was stunningly beautiful. The day before, it had remained calm and serene, except for the soft waves breaking against the shore. Yet today, the wind had transformed the lake into a raging sea, enveloping it with foam. The sparkling sand lining the shore appeared to be a bejeweled setting for this natural wonder, and the long peninsulas, covered in dense pine, added to the charming scenery. I had never seen water so strikingly beautiful. Waves 4 feet high rolled in as we gazed out at the uncertain number of 6 or 7 large islands before us. Only upon reaching the south shore would we know for sure. The wooded hills ahead could be either islands or promontories. We could not discern. Along the shore, an abundance of carnelians, crystallized quartz, agates, petrified wood specimens, and lava pebbles were discovered. Peculiar slates in the form of hollowed-out cups, discs, and 2 well-formed resemblances of a leg and foot were among the many interesting objects we found scattered in this watery solitude. All seemed to be the result of fire and water coalescing, the fire forming and baking them, and the water polishing them. We henceforth named this spot Curiosity Point. If Mount Washington were to be dropped into the lake, its peak would be submerged 2,000 feet below the water's surface. Following an evening conference, the party had to decide whether to continue around the lake or retrace our steps and make a pass over to the Madison along the north side of the lake. By a vote of 6 to 3, we committed to taking the trip around the lake, while Mr. Hauser advocated for a return to the north side. I voted to travel around the lake. As we wandered along the shore today, we beheld steam rising from an extensive grouping of hot springs on the opposite side of the lake, by what appeared to be the farthest bay or estuary. We will examine them at close range when we finish our journey around the lake. Tuesday, September 6th. We set off from our campsite at 10:30 in the morning, heading southeast for an hour before turning almost directly south. The trail led us through a dense forest, with much of our journey impeded by fallen trees. We only managed to cover about 10 miles before calling it a day. We had to frequently leave the woodland trail and follow the shoreline of the lake instead. As we passed the base of the Brimstone Basin, we saw a panoramic view of the mountains forming a semicircle around it, with the lake completing the circle. Lieutenant Doane and I decided to ascend the mountain, where for the next few miles and halfway up the summit, we came across a peculiar substance that appeared to be a mixture of sulfate lime and sulfur flowers. At certain times, exhales were emanating from all parts of the ground. The scent of brimstone was quite strong, but it was clear the volcanic activity in this region was slowly fading. Halfway up the mountain, there were several small streams with sulfur in solution, and further down towards the base, dried-up beds of numerous streams from 10 to 20 feet wide revealed signs of once being filled to the brim up to 3 feet deep with sulfur water. The current small streams were tepid. The side of the mountain where we rode seemed to be mostly hollow, and it made a rumbling sound beneath our feet. The crust we rode on was quite strong, unlike the one at Crater Hill, where the flames raged and the incrustation had many vents and fissures emitting choking sulfur vapors. On the flanks of the mountain lay ancient crevices, enveloped in rusty-looking incrustations of sulfur, worn away now by the passage of time. It's clear the mountain once burned with the same intensity we witnessed at Crater Hill, though every external sign of that fiery past has long since vanished, aside from the warm streamlets cascading down its slopes. For 2 days we've trudged almost due south towards Wind River Mountains, spotting plentiful elk and bear tracks. Every so often we come across the pathway left by a mighty mountain lion, no doubt hungry for prey. Wednesday, September 7th. Last night, while all but the guards were in slumber, we were shaken awake by a piercing scream that echoed across the wilderness. It rang out so much like a human voice that for a moment I was certain some poor soul had lost their way and was calling out for help. But as I stumbled out of my tent, rifle at the ready, the truth became clear. The haunting cry belonged to a mountain lion prowling the woods around us. Our camp had been set near a stream that fed into the southeast arm of Yellowstone Lake. Some suggested calling this waterway the Upper Yellowstone, but Lieutenant Doane suspected that an old map had labeled it the Bridger. While we debated the matter, our attention was captured by the difficulty we'd face if we tried to cross the river at this spot. The mud was too deep, and our horses sank up to their bellies. Seeking a solution, General Washburn and a few others set out at first light to scout the area for a more manageable crossing. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Doane and I ventured out to survey the rise of the mountains on the opposite side of the camp. Our mission was to assess the shape of the lake and determine the best path for our journey around it. There was an excitement to these expeditions that transcended the work and made them truly enjoyable. We knew that meeting a large band of Indians this early on our journey was unlikely, mainly due to the superstitions that surrounded the volcanic activity of this region. Nonetheless, we remained vigilant, our eyes and ears keen to every sound and movement that crossed our path. We followed the steep bank that overlooked the river bottom, where the water flowed in a southeasterly direction for about 3 miles. Then we found ourselves in a densely forested ravine, where we had to navigate through thick underbrush and over rocky terrain with our horses. Often we had to dismount and lead our horses over difficult terrain, such as protruding rocks or dense bushes and fallen trees. After 2 hours, we reached a point in our ascent where it was no longer safe to ride horses due to the steep mountain incline. We dismounted and led our horses for about an hour as we made our way up the steep mountainside. Once we felt that it was safe for us to mount our horses, we continued on slowly, occasionally stopping to allow the horses to rest and breathe. However, when we arrived at the limit of vegetation, we tied our horses before commencing our ascent up the steepest part of the mountain, made of broken granite. It was crucial to be careful and avoid sliding down the mountain, and it took over 4 hours to get to the top. As we trekked through the mountain, we saw the tracks of mountain sheep along the way. From the top of the mountain, we beheld a breathtaking view filled with wild and rugged grandeur that surpassed any I had witnessed before. The Yellowstone Basin and the Wind River Mountains spread out before us like a detailed map. To the south, we followed the source of the Yellowstone until it was lost in an enormous canyon, over 25 miles away. We also saw two massive jets of vapor rising to almost 300 feet, indicating that there were other and perhaps greater wonders outside our prescribed limit of exploration. From our vantage point on the mountain, the view was a sight to behold. In the north, the lake's outlet and the steam rising from the mud geyser and mud volcano were visible. But it was the southeast that captured our attention, with a sweeping view of a massive range of peaks spanning at least 30 miles in width. These peaks boasted jagged slopes, pine-enclosed recesses, and towering cliffs, some reaching heights of hundreds or even thousands of feet. Captain Reynolds had attempted to explore this very range from the east in 1860 and found it impassable, a fact I would eagerly investigate upon my return home. The peak we stood upon marked the westernmost point of the range, which continued to extend majestically towards the southeastern horizon. The range's central line was an unbroken ridge comprised of countless formations, points, knobs, glens, and defiles, each one as grand and magnificent as the next. Sprouting from either side of this central line of peaks were numerous lofty peaks, vying for attention with their own unique beauty. Everywhere we looked, it was a scene of breathtaking majesty. Small lakes dotted the valley at the base of the range, each one reflecting the surrounding mountain's beauty. Lakes were ubiquitous in the area, in the valleys, on the mountains, and even farther down the slopes, at all elevations. The entire range emanated a sense of ancient existence, perhaps once a high plateau, now cut down by the action of water over ages between the peaks, carving deep gorges and canyons. In many places, the slopes of the mountains formed sheer cliffs with walls that rose from 600 to 1,000 feet in height, demonstrating the immense power of water over time. This range of mountains held a wondrous history, the most remarkable lateral ridge of the Rocky Range. In 1811, while crossing the continent, Captain Wilson P. Hunt, part of Mr. Astor's expedition, found his progress thwarted by this range's eastern base. After numerous failed attempts to scale it, they were forced to travel through the valley of Snake River, enduring several discouraging disasters before finally reaching their destination at Astoria. Somewhere in the pages of Washington Irving's Astoria or Bonneville's Adventures, I came across an interesting tale. The Native Americans believed that the ridge of mountains we stood upon was the world's crest. Among the Blackfeet tribe, they tell a fable that anyone who reaches the summit can see the land of souls and the happy hunting grounds below, where free and generous spirits dwell. After a taxing 4-hour climb, Lieutenant Doane and I found ourselves on the mountaintop, gasping for breath. We took a moment to rest and replenish ourselves with whatever sustenance we could find. Yet despite being on the mountain's crest, we did not witness any free and generous spirits, unless one counts the blurry figures we saw through a glass darkly. On the east slope of the mountain, we left our horses behind where the snow was almost level with a 30-foot outer edge stretching upward. This snowbank is eternal, so vast it seemed almost unreal. Our aneroid barometer showed that the altitude at this location was 9,476 feet, while on the summit it reached 10,327 feet. The difference between the two was 581 feet, leading up to the rocky pinnacle. The journey down the mountain took us about an hour and a quarter, during which we stumbled upon the pack train's trail. There we noticed 3 poles set in the shape of a tripod, the longer one directed towards the right, signaling a change of direction. Following the advice of the Indian symbol, we made our way down the bank that marked the edge of the valley and moved across the lowlands towards the river. We crossed it at a point where it stretched roughly 90 feet across and its waters were only 3 feet deep, its current moving at a swift clip of about 6 miles per hour. We were now 6 or 7 miles from the river's mouth. Our group continued on the path set by the lead team, which led us through a picturesque and pleasant grove of pine trees, their branches untangled and free from the usual clutter one expects on the forest floor. We journeyed for 2 miles and passed 2 exquisite lakes. Nightfall had arrived, and the trail was becoming increasingly tough to follow as the light faded. The only guide was the tracks on the ground left by the horses, which were nearly impossible to distinguish. We persevered, keeping a keen eye on the dark, twisting path of earth that lay before us. Eventually, the trail turned up the mountain's side, and we went after it for over a mile, just following in its wake. We began to fear we were on the wrong path, dismounted our horses, and cast our gaze to the ground. We searched it closely, but there was not a single mark left by a horse's shoe to be found. With the help of some dry pine branches, we lit a fire directly on the trail, hopeful that we would soon see traces of our lost team. What we learned instead was that we had followed the trail of a herd of elk that had crossed paths with the pack train's route at the base of the mountain, and in the low light of the day's end, we hadn't picked up on our mistake. Suddenly, the idea of spending the night on the mountain without blankets or dinner was all too real. But we promptly doubled back towards the mountain's base at top speed, then chose to journey towards the lake, thinking it most likely that our group had set up camp on its shores. If so, we would discover them there. If they were nowhere near the beach, we couldn't find them at all. Our journey through the forest was nothing short of treacherous. Fallen trees and marshlands posed a constant threat to our progress, but surprisingly the cloak of night provided an advantage. Without the ability to see what lay ahead, we relied on our instincts and the steady guidance of our companions to navigate the treacherous terrain. As we reached the edge of the lake, a glimmer of light shone in the distance, a beacon of hope that signaled our comrades were near. With a boisterous shout, we announced our arrival, and just as quickly we received an enthusiastic response from our fellow warriors. The knowledge that they shared our fears and concerns during our journey brought a sense of comfort and solidarity to our group. Our current encampment rests at the westerly side of the lake's southeasterly bay. The various bays are separated by long stretches of land that extend deep into the water. From a distance, some of them appeared as if they were small islands, but upon closer examination they proved to be mere promontories. During past excursions, attempts were made to outline the lake's perimeter, but the rough terrain impeded any serious progress. However, today, from the peak of a mountain, both General Washburn and Hauser accompanied me in mapping the north and eastern sides of the lake, with some south side areas noted as well. Though we faced significant obstacles due to heavy timber located on the promontories, the results proved satisfying, with General Washburn even suggesting that my name join the title of the newly discovered peak. Our journey from the morning camp has spanned 12 miles, yet we are only separated by a mere 4 miles in a straight line. Thursday, September 8th. Our travels today have taken us on a convoluted path through fallen timber that stretched nearly 12 miles. Eventually, we came to a stop at a small creek that was roughly a mile away from the southernmost section of the lake. If we drew a straight line from our earlier camp this morning, it would measure about 7 miles to this location. It was an arduous day for both us and our horses. The trees stood so close together that it was a daunting task to find a way through. The pack animals had to be squeezed through narrow gaps whenever possible, and we would often lose one another as we searched for a feasible trail. Hedges and Stickney inadvertently became lone travelers after becoming detached from our group. They roamed around lost for a while, experiencing the harsh loneliness of being lost in the wilderness. Eventually, they found their way back to camp, looking beyond thrilled and extremely relieved. I could completely sympathize with the men, as I had encountered similar experiences back in 1862. Being stranded and not knowing your way can make a person feel unimaginably desolate. At one juncture, while searching for a trail marker, a mammoth grizzly bear appeared and sped past them. The animal spooked Hedges's steed, resulting in it breaking its bridle and galloping off. After dinner, Washburn and Hauser marched up to the ridge behind our camp to scout the area. They soon encountered a mother bear along with her 2 cubs. Lacking weapons, the pair shortly took flight back to camp to retrieve their firearms. They, along with several others, embarked on a bear hunt. The thrill of bagging a big grizzly fueled the men's excitement. After all, what chance did one have against 6 hunters, especially when the grizzly had little ones to protect? As we prepared for the attack, our discussion turned to the 2 cubs we planned to capture alive. Some suggested taking them back to Helena, but our packers, Bean and Reynolds, vetoed the idea unless the cubs could be utilized as pack animals. We eventually reached the spot where the bear was last seen. Tracking her led us to a dense thicket, which we did not dare to penetrate due to the darkness. None of us felt that we had lost her, though. Throughout the day we trekked through a tough forest of pines, obstructed on all sides by fallen tree trunks. Encouraging the pack train, picking suitable paths, freeing the horses when they were stuck, and readjusting the packs required enormous patience and effort. The struggle between our meekness and the hindrances in our way often resulted in sullenness or outbursts of anger, akin to the volcanic activity of the region. As we continued our adventure, Jake Smith made a sensible comment, albeit with inaccurate scriptural references. "I always considered Daniel a great fool to go into a den of bears." In one instance, we found ourselves entangled in a vast net of fallen timber and brush. Each man had his own notion of how to get out, causing tempers to flare and conversations to turn to half-angry expletives. It was then that I remembered the beautiful line from Byron's Childe Harold, "There is a pleasure in the pathless woods," so I recited it with all the ore rotundo I could muster. To our surprise, the ridiculousness of the situation struck a chord, and we all burst into uproarious laughter. The sudden shift from anger to hilarity brought us together and brought back the pleasure of being in the pathless wilderness. One of our pack horses, owned by Judge Hedges, always keeps us entertained. The judge, while not being much of a horse judge, was told by the previous owner that this was an animal that drives the herd before him. Unfortunately, the judge did not understand that the horse would be trailing behind the rest of the herd due to exhaustion. The pony is always up to some acrobatic feat or is falling over something while traveling with us through the forest. Progress became impossible today without leaping over fallen trees. Our little bronco has spirit but often lacks the strength to make it over the tree trunks. As a result, he frequently rests on his midriff, his fore and hind legs suspended on either side of a massive log. He displays a determined spirit, exceeded only by his patience. Despite numerous mishaps that would have disabled a larger animal, we fondly call him Little Invulnerable. Private Moore from our escort made a sketch of the bronco as it lay across the log, and I look forward to a copy of the drawing. I let out an annoyed growl in Hauser's direction and gave him a stern talking to tonight at camp. I won't go into the details, but I must admit that I could stand to be more patient. The weariness of our journey is beginning to seep into my bones. However, it's important to note that I am one of the few in our band who can handle the physical and mental toil of this expedition. I would be remiss if I let my frustrations get the best of me. There are few things in life that test one's patience more than a lengthy journey by wagon or pack train through uncharted territory. Even the most serene of souls can be pushed to their limits. Those lacking in equanimity will likely find themselves exploding with anger and violence. Not even education or the most rigorous training can guarantee a calm demeanor during a grueling excursion through a land filled with obstacles. This journey we're on is the perfect subject for philosophical contemplation as we all strive to help one another carry the burdens along the way. Friday, September 9th. Last night there was an incident that I have no intention of leaving out of my account of our time in camp. A true and complete record of our journey demands that I share everything of interest, without malice or spite. Mr. Hedges and I were on guard duty during the last shift of the night, from the wee hours until daybreak. As the night went on, Hedges, perhaps tempted by the devilish spirits that wander these sulphuric lands, asked me if I was hungry. I admitted that I had been craving food ever since our supplies had dwindled. With no cooked food left in camp, Mr. Hedges proposed that we each take a wing from one of the partridges and grill it over our small fire. It was a brilliant idea, as Judge Bradford of Colorado would say, and we acted upon it quickly. However, upon discovering so little meat on the wings, I decided to roast a leg instead. As our appetites grew, we even went so far as to cook the breast of the bird. As we ate, our consciences began to trouble us. We envisioned the disappointment of our fellow campers, who would only receive a small portion of one partridge each for breakfast. It didn't take long for us to make the decision to sacrifice the other bird for the greater good of the group. We debated whether or not it would be missed in the morning, with Hedges taking the affirmative and myself taking the negative side of the argument. This morning, as we were just about finished with breakfast, Mr. Hauser asked our cook, "Newt, about the partridges that were supposed to be part of our meal. Newt explained that when he went to retrieve them this morning, they were done gone, and he suspected that Booby, our dog, had eaten them. Without hesitation, Hauser started throwing stones and sticks at poor Booby in frustration. Hedges and I struggled to hold in our laughter, exchanging knowing glances while listening to the rest of the group complain about Booby's worthlessness. Suddenly, Gillette asked, "Who was on guard last night?" The realization hit us like a ton of bricks. We had been the ones to gobble up the partridges during our late-night watch. Hedges and I couldn't contain ourselves any longer, and our laughter filled the campsite. We came clean, and poor Booby was exonerated, welcomed back with open arms and plenty of pats on the head. Mr. Hauser, who had shot down the birds with incredible accuracy while riding his horse, had hoped for a tasty breakfast, but he took the whole ordeal in stride. Hauser is a true philosopher. I've come to know this during our 8 years together. He doesn't waste time fretting over things he can't fix. Honestly, he's the best possible companion for a trip like this. Booby is growing increasingly fond of the buckskin moccasins that Newt fashioned for him and placed on his paws. When the footwear was first introduced, Booby objected and tried to remove them with his teeth. However, he has since realized that they alleviate his discomfort. This demonstrates that the name Booby may not accurately reflect his true nature, and there may be more to him than meets the eye. In fact, Booby is quite useful, as he is always on the alert for unfamiliar noises or movements. I find comfort in knowing that he will sound the alarm in the event that a group of thieving Indians approaches our camp at night. Jake Smith was serving as our sentinel 3 nights ago, but he was so blasé about the potential for danger that he managed to take a nap while on duty. I asked Private Moore, our artist, to portray Smith snoozing with his saddle as a cushion. Jake's guard duty mantra could be "Rest in peace," as he seems to have little regard for his responsibilities during these times. I say seems because I don't think Jake is capable of accurately repeating that phrase. On another occasion, Jake attempted to use a quote from Shakespeare to discredit a fellow member of our group who was telling what seemed to be a tall tale. Jake went so far as to declare that the words of the immortal Shakespeare, "Othello's reputation's gone," applied to the situation. This morning we broke camp at 10 o'clock with our pack train and began traveling west. After a couple of miles, we gradually altered our course to the east, navigating through fallen timber that many would consider impassable. Even our pack horses had a tough time with the dense debris, as the packs they carried would frequently get caught on the trees. We often had to rearrange and lessen the load to get the packs through the narrow passages.